Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. In this episode, we will continue our exploration of spinal cord injury. In this episode, I'll be speaking to Susan Mockler to discuss her book, Fractured. Susan is a writer and retired clinical psychologist living in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And Fractured is her memoir, which details her experiences of acquiring disability following a car accident which left her with a spinal cord injury. The book was published back in 2022. Her essays and stories have also appeared in a range of American and Canadian publications. Susan Mockler, welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast, and I'm most grateful that you accepted my invitation to be here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Um, uh, it's kind of a harrowing accident. Why did you decide to write about it? What was the inspiration behind writing on this?
Sure. I guess initially I wrote the book, I started the book probably at least 15 years after my spinal cord injury. And I had written stories before, mostly fiction, and it just seemed to me imperative that the next thing I write be about my accident and my spinal cord injury. And so I think part of it was to try to kind of, in retrospect, grapple to with what had happened to me and sort of deepen my understanding of how that had affected me, both at the time and as my life had progressed. And then in writing it, I realized that I was also documenting the experience of acquiring a disability. And that from that perspective, that it also serves to illustrate the way that people with disabilities, because I had so suddenly gone from able-bodied to disabled, I was also documenting the way that people with disabilities can often be discriminated against and marginalized in our society. And so I guess it was both those things, so that I hoped, sort of as I understood that component of my book better, that it would help to raise awareness and serve in some ways to contribute to disability literature and advocacy.
Okay. So given the gap between the accident and your writing, this was not a cathartic exercise, was it? It wasn't you trying to kind of come to grips with something about what happened.
I guess not in the immediate emotional connection of it. But one thing I'll say is that I started the book as a novel.
Okay.
So my whole first draft of the book was a novel. And I think that I needed to do that in order to get the emotional distance and write about myself as a character to actually start to get closer to the emotional truth.
Okay.
And then I got feedback to change it to be a memoir. And with sort of at each successive iteration of the book and the editing, I feel like I got closer and closer to the emotional truth of what had happened to me. And so while there wasn't an immediate catharsis, I think it allowed me to articulate and feel that experience that I had kind of detached from in order to survive in a very different way. And I hope that some of that emotional truth is now evident in the memoir. But it took me a long time and a lot of iterations to get there.
Yeah, we'll get to talk about a lot of emotional distancing in the
Yes.
that appeared in the narrative. So the accident was way back in August 95. You were a front seat passenger. Your friend Gary was driving, and you hit a moose, and
Yes.
that clearly a life-changing accident. What were the circumstances leading to the accident? What was it?
Well, I was going on holiday and At the time, I was living in Ottawa, Ontario, which is quite near to the Quebec border. And we were going on a hiking vacation to New Hampshire in the United States, which is about a 2-day drive from where I was living. And we were supposed to actually go the next morning. And I had sort of impulsively thought, why don't we just go tonight? We can get, you know, either past, we were about an hour and a bit from Montreal. We can get past there, maybe get to the Vermont border. And so it was kind of a spontaneous um, decision. And so we set off, and we were on a 4-lane highway, a big 4-lane highway. And I had driven up north before, where you're much more aware that moose can be a problem. It never occurred to me that there would be moose along there. But anyway, we were driving, and the car hit a moose, and it was a very small car. And so the head of the moose came onto my side of the passenger side of the vehicle and basically broke my neck. Fractured the two highest vertebrae, C1 and C2. Now, I have no memory of the accident. I had no idea it was happening. Um, I had seen, and whether I filled this in retrospectively, but my memory is that I had seen a moose warning sign before it happened. And I remember having the thought, I didn't know that there would be moose here. And but I had no experience that this was about to happen or that that had happened. So I sort of went from we were driving, and then I was being resuscitated by paramedics.
There wasn't any head injury, concussion, anything like that? Or there
There
should.
was a concussion, but it was probably fairly severe. But I didn't. When I lost consciousness, I don't think it was for very long, and there was nothing. The neurologist said there was nothing indicative of a serious head injury beyond a concussion can be, but no, um, nothing, nothing that was as substantial, obviously, as the spinal cord injury.
And you came around in hospital and you said you couldn't feel anything, you couldn't move. Um, you said I was only mine, my body had disappeared. Was the full impact of the injury so immediately evident to you on coming around then, so straight away?
I certainly what had happened in terms of having a spinal cord injury was not. But my conscious awareness when I first regained consciousness was that I couldn't move and I couldn't feel anything. So I was very much aware of that disconnection immediately.
Mm.
The cause of it or anything like that, I was not aware of initially.
And then there was this sense of things not being real. You talked about feeling disembodied, hovering over your body's plate on the examining table. That's how you put it. Um, what is this the kind of thing people talk about with the near-death experience, or was it all part of this concussion, or did you attribute it to the spinal cord injury?
It's a very interesting question because I'd never thought of it as a near-death
No, I
experience.
wondered what it would be. Yeah.
Yeah, and so possibly, I mean, I certainly was aware that I could die any minute. That was one thing that was very clear to me. Um, it was more this sense of complete unreality because I was lying on this examining table. Nurses and doctors were kind of my experience of it was whizzing around me, doing this, doing that. I knew they were trying to save me, but I had no context for this other than really having watched it on TV.
Yeah.
And so there was just this sense of it was happening, but how could this be real? How could this have happened so quickly? And so that sense of dislocation and the sense of not being in reality, I think, made me see myself in that moment as the other that this was happening to.
You said you felt like a stranger to your own body. I guess it's the brain trying to make sense of being disconnected with the rest of the body, I suppose.
Yes, I think very much so. And I think that before that moment, I mean, when I had been uninjured and able-bodied, there's a fluidity between mind and body. And, if you want to move your arm, you move your arm. If you want to, and you don't, it's almost unconscious. And all of a sudden, that was
Mm.
completely absent. And so it was, what am I located in now? Right? What is this? And so I think you're right. It's trying to grapple with all the sensations or the lack of sensations that I was experiencing at the time.
Um, and the other thing, which I mean, you talked about getting to grips with disability, but it looked like quite early on when you were being transported to a larger hospital, you said other people were making decisions for me now. Um, was the understanding then that because you had this physical disability, you also were not mentally able to make decisions for yourself, even as early as that time?
That's a very good question. I don't know if I had pieced all of that together yet. I think, um, but I think that's true, and that happens all the time. But I don't think I had really conceptualized that component of it yet. I think it was more that I realized that my integrity and life were in the hands of other people,
Mm.
and that they knew better than I did what to do to take care of me. And so I had to give up in that moment that sense of autonomy because I didn't know. I really didn't understand. I knew something was very wrong, but I also knew that I had to trust. And so I think that was sort of my sense of it when I wrote that
Which is quite reasonable. I was just kind of wondering whether it was a forerunner of what was going to happen further down the line. Then you had this MRI, which showed an incomplete spinal cord injury. The fracture had decompressed, meaning you didn't require surgery. What could you do with your limbs at that time? Could you do anything at all, arms and legs?
No, I was completely paralyzed and had no sensation from the neck down. Now, later after the MRI, I was transferred to basically a neurology intensive care unit in the same hospital. And when the nurse was sort of setting me up, um, she found a call bell system where it was a large pad that was very sensitive to the slightest touch. And she put it in my left hand. So she had seen there was a little bit of finger movement. And so she put it in my left hand and asked me to squeeze. And so I remember the sensation of thinking the movement to squeeze my left hand, but not really knowing whether anything had happened. until I saw the call bell light up. So I did have, I guess at that time, some very, very weak, limited finger movement, but I had no awareness of that until she kind of facilitated that.
Yeah, an incomplete spinal cord injuries, you rightly said, is Brown-Séquard syndrome. And you said this saved your life. What did you mean by that? How does it what's so good about this bad situation, even though, yeah, it was spinal cord, but something.
Well, with the Brown-Séquard, and this is my understanding, so I leave it to you if I misrepresent the injury. But my understanding of my injury was that, and experientially, I have this sense of my injury, is that really what it meant was where there was a contusion on the spinal cord, it it had the contusion had happened in such a way that my motor functioning was more affected on, in my case, the right side, and my sensation was more affected, in my case, on the left side. Because my injury was so high, my diaphragm would collapse at the time of the injury. But because of the Brown-Séquard syndrome, my diaphragm only collapsed on the right side. So I was able to take in sufficient oxygen until the paramedics came. And obviously I still needed oxygen at that point. So that did save my life, because without that, especially because we were, some distance from hospital or paramedics, probably both diaphragms would have collapsed and I likely would have died.
I wanted to hear it in your own words. If I did, I'll probably make it complicated and too academic.
Okay, yeah,
That's
I want to make sure I'm describing it
yeah, that's very clear.
accurately.
Yeah. Um, so at the time, neurosurgeons saw you and kind of bluntly said you would never walk again. Um, we're kind of taught now about how to break bad news. What was your experience of that breaking bad news event?
It was I mean, I was honestly still kind of in a state of shock. I knew there was something really wrong. I must have picked up more in the ER than I had realized, because I kind of knew they were assessing the spinal cord. Um, when he said that, I guess my immediate reaction was I heard it and I understood it for sure. But I immediately wanted to know what were the other parameters. And so I asked, and he had prefaced it by saying, there's good news, it's incomplete, and we don't have to operate. But but then he said, but then he was very, very blunt, right? And but I immediately sort of asked, well, does motivation help? Is recovery possible? Does motivation help? And he said, yes, yes, it does. And then I asked if I could work. And I remember him saying, well, it depends what you do. And so I said, at that time, I was working as a researcher for the federal government, but I was also completing my doctorate in psychology part time. So I said, well, if I'm a clinical psychologist. And he said, yeah, probably you can. And so I guess immediately I was probably grappling to feel like I could have some control over the situation. Um, but just those little spaces gave me some sense of hope, and so that was important. But yeah, it was shocking. But it's interesting because in retrospect, I mean, that's something you hear even before my injury, you can't walk, they can't walk again. But my own experience and other people with quadriplegic injuries might have a very different sense of it. But walking was the least of my problems. I mean, it's really being able to have some hand and arm function,
Mm.
because that's what allows you to have independence. And it's great to walk, but it really just moves you from place to place, and there's other things that can do that. So anyway, so I've thought about that afterwards too, that it's an interesting thing, but it's something in our culture, or at least at that time, that people would say to make the impact known. Um,
So you kind of clear-headed even at that time to kind of weigh the pros and the cons. You refer
Apparently, right?
at least trying to see it more of a glass half full than
Hmm.
you talked about the absence of emotions you experienced very early on. You said you were not sad, but you experienced fleeting moments of panic that you quickly shut down. Um, is this kind of a defense mechanism you've used in the past to deal with stressful situations? You kind of create that distance.
I think so, and I think that it serves me very well, to be honest with you. At the time, yeah, I think it's something I have used in the past. I had quite a difficult childhood, and so I think that the tendency to disassociate or to shut down and disconnect from my emotions was almost second nature to me. And so it allowed me to focus instead on what I needed to do to try to survive and ideally attain some recovery, some return of function. And I think if I had been overwhelmed by kind of what had happened or what might happen in the future, I don't think I would have been able to so fully um, fully take advantage of rehabilitation or be present in the same way.
And did that distancing means you didn't go through a kind of the denial phase, whatever was happening?
Not at the time. Not at the time. No, I don't think that I did. I mean, I knew that I might never recover. And I certainly didn't deny that, but I sort of, and I guess this was the other part of the disassociation was, or not disassociation, but another coping strategy I used was to focus on what might come next,
Okay.
what was possible in the future. And I had also used that in the past. And so, in some ways, the way that I tried to, or I sort of thought about it myself, was that I had been informed that the first 6 weeks you're in spinal shock. At that time, they said recovery can, a lot of recoveries in the first year, then it can be up to 2 years. So I knew I had time. And so I thought, I will grieve for what I've lost when I see what I've lost.
Okay.
And and but which helped, right? It really, so I was sort of postponing that. But at that time, I was really only focusing on my physical and physiological recovery. And I think the grief over having an entirely different life, having sort of this before and after in my life, I think that came much, much later. But that wasn't on my mind at the time.
Okay. That's yeah, people kind of yeah, people are different, isn't it, when they're faced with this? I've read memoirs where people feel denial pushes them to overcome whatever difficulties they're facing. It's not happening, and then they push. But clearly, I mean, you're achieving the same objective, but in a different.
Hmm.
That's interesting. Um, and then, of course, you focus on the positive, but you still had this periods of kind of I don't want to call it depression, but kind of when you're down. You talked about how the accident had robbed you instantaneously of your real life and imprisoned you in this body, this living corpse. Um, did you have any sustained periods of being depressed or low on account of it?
I had momentary, um, sort of momentary senses of definitely depression. I had certainly experienced depression and anxiety pre-accident and still do post-accident. But there was something about that time, and I think it might have been the absolute intensity of the experience and my focus,
Hmm.
that I was less depressed and less anxious than I ever remember being before or since. I certainly had thoughts of sadness and thoughts of frustration, but it was like I was encapsulated in this dance almost between my body and myself, and that just seemed, that intensity of that experience seemed to take away everything else in that moment for that time.
It's interesting. Um, and then from the intensive care unit, you were taken, I think, to the neurology general ward, and I wasn't quite sure. I got the feeling it wasn't a very good experience. You talked about an endless succession of strangers who didn't bother to address me by name, and it felt as if they were warehousing my body, the remnants of me. Um, what was that experience like?
It was very difficult. It was when I was in the sort of the intensive care area. The nurses there were very, very good and very nice to me, and treated me like a person. When I was moved into the ward, I was in the ward for 2 weeks before I could get into the rehabilitation center. And so the change in my care was a shock to me. The nature of my care hadn't changed. At that point, I had no movement. I had to be log rolled. I had to be cathetered. I had to be fed. I think I was mostly just drinking Ensure at that time. Like, it took me a long time to want to eat. But there was, and in all fairness to them, I mean, I think at that time, I hope it's better now that training's better. But I think in some ways, their attitude towards me is sort of this desperate, damaged body that they were the caretakers of reluctantly, it felt like sometimes. Was is also reflective of the way our society in general treats those or thinks about those who are disabled. And so, that I think I certainly felt like I was not being treated like a person. And in fact, in one instance, there were several instances. And in one instance, I had the doctors came very early on rounds, and And the doctors were good, right? The doctors were nice to me and did treat me respectfully, particularly the spinal cord injury doctors who was going to see in rehab. But the doctors came very early on rounds, and so I had my mother write out a list of questions that I wanted to ask them and had her post it on the wall so I could see it and ask them the questions. And I remember this nurse coming in and asking me what it was and sort of shaking her head and looking at the other nurse and saying, well, how's that for patient empowerment? And 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 um, and so it was like I um, I had no physical agency at the time, but I did have intellectual and emotional agency. But it was like I was just nothing, and so that it was upsetting. And I complained. I complained to the head nurse, but that wasn't particularly satisfying either. I'm still a bit angry about it,
Mm.
but I hope it's a reflection of its time and that things have improved because you have to treat everybody like a human being in any caregiving profession or in general.
Yeah.
It's a good idea, right?
It's a simple courtesy, isn't it? Even if it's
Yes,
just on the street, I suppose.
yes,
Um, but to redeem, clearly the experience on the ICU was positive. And the
very.
experience as well, you particularly praised Nurse Martha. Um, what was it about her care that stood out for you? That
I
was.
think I think a couple of things. The way that they did it at that time was you had a primary and secondary care nurse. So you saw other nurses at times, um, but that allowed you to build a relationship with your primary care nurse and your secondary care nurse. And probably um, the thing that was so helpful with her was how caring she was, and how, in contrast, she really did treat me like a person.
Mm.
You know, she got to know me as a person. She was a very soft-spoken woman, and very experienced in working with people with quadriplegic and paraplegic and other kinds of spinal cord injuries. But I think it's the humanity and being treated like humanity when you're feeling vulnerable and scared and not really sure
Mm.
where your humanity is anymore.
And yeah, and the rehab ward also kind of give you a lot of hope, which some of the nurses before then had taken.
That's right. That's right.
Um, and you said without that hope, you would have plunged into a cavernous darkness. How important was that hope in actually guiding your rehab? Would you have done as well if you didn't have the hope?
I don't think so. I think that hope is life, and that I hoped to recover. I particularly hoped to recover enough to be able to function and live independently. That was probably my largest hope. But but so there is hope for recovery, but I think it's also important in situations like this where there's such a change in life that there has to be hope conveyed, that no matter how you are, or how, if you end up not recovering very much, that there's a hope of a continued life that's meaningful and valuable, and there's a hope that you can reconnect to that again. And I think that's probably the most important type of hope, because nobody knows how much you're going to recover, right? Nobody knew.
That's true.
And I didn't,
Hmm.
but my hope to recover did sustain me, but the hope that I could go back into the world and exist in a meaningful way was essential. And I think the rehabilitation center was instrumental in facilitating that, in teaching you ways that that can happen, and that also. And I think it's also important, if you're quadriplegic and if I had ended up needing attendant care, that there's different ways of being independent,
Hmm.
so that there's different ways of being in the world that can still be autonomous, and you can still have agency, and you can still function. And so there were a lot of ways, indirectly and directly, that that was conveyed to me.
We talk about precision medicine. I suspect there's precision rehab as well. What do you think? Kind of targeted to each person, isn't it? Rather than just one, one.
Exactly. I would hope so anyway. That was my experience. I felt very targeted to me.
That's good. And you did say your recovery was steady but slow. How much better did you get?
By the time I was discharged from the rehab center, I was walking with a four-prong cane,
Okay.
and I rented a wheelchair for a while, for longer distances. Basically, both, I even now as I speak, there's less motoric function in my right leg, but it works fairly well, and the strength is pretty good. I do have a bit of a problem with foot drop and dorsiflexion, but I can walk fairly well. Probably the least recovered aspect is my right arm. And so functionally, I don't have much use of it. I can use it to support things. And I mean, I can, if I need to, like, put an adapted spoon in it and feed myself. But really, there's not a lot of functional return to my right hand. Then within the year, I was walking without a gait aid. I was walking long distances. I was able to exercise again, and that was the case for about 20 years. And I had a couple of bad falls. I didn't really hurt myself. I mean, it was traumatic, but it kind of shook my confidence. So now I use a walking pole
Okay.
when I walk, and I'm sort of still kind of grappling with sort of feeling safe and less anxious. I had none of that before, but that's just life happens, right? So, but my recovery's been, given my injury, my recovery's been very, very, I've been very fortunate.
What does that say about neurosurgical predictions?
It's very interesting because I've, I mean, I didn't have a lot to do with the neurosurgeons after, but I did go back after 3 months to get my halo taken off.
Okay.
And where I was, the rehab center was attached to the general hospital. And I remember going in and I was explaining that I had started walking in the parallel bars, and wasn't walking much. And I don't think I was walking with a cane yet, but I definitely had started walking. And I remember the neurosurgeon looked at the resident, he was a senior resident, and said, "Do you remember her injury? I can't believe it. We should do a study on you on motivation." And I was so glad, you referred to him being blunt. I was so glad I didn't know the full truth of what they thought at the time, because I was like, well, said recovery was possible. You said motivation helped. So There's just so many factors, right? I mean, in your business, but in your specialty, but there's just so many factors, and some of them I think are ephemeral, right? We just don't know.
Yeah, and neuroplasticity is it's kind of a relatively new concept, and
Yes.
we kind of know a lot happens for a long time. Yeah. Do you still notice any improvements, say, every 6 months or 12 months? Do you notice any, or do you think it's kind of plateaued at?
It's plateaued. It's variable though. Like certainly, I work with a trainer who I've been working with for 20 years, so we know each other very well. And and we were talking the other day, or maybe a couple of months ago, and I said, my right arm's a lot better than it used to be. And I said, do you think it is? And she said, yes.
Mm.
And then she was saying that she thought my articulation and my gait was a lot better. And as I said, I've been sort of beset with these anxiety problems, which are complex when you have a spinal cord injury because it increases spasticity. So I've really been negotiating that, and it's getting much better. But so there are things that have changed, and I get Botox injections for spasticity in my lower limb and also in my arm and my fingers. And I just went on Monday to get them. And typically I get them every 3 months. And when I was supposed to get them last time, I canceled the appointment because the spasticity seemed so much less.
Mm.
And when I saw the physiatrist on Monday, she said, it's so much better. It's so much better than it was. So I don't know why. So there are changes, but one thing that's challenging with a spinal cord injury
Mm.
is that stability is hard to come by. You think you're stable. I thought I was stable 20 years. I thought this is my limit. This is where I am.
Yes.
And so sometimes the lack of stability leads to these surprising improvements.
Mm.
And other times, there can be an increase in spasticity related to emotional events and other things that can make things more challenging. And that's just the nature of things. But yes, I would say, much to my surprise, that some things do seem to still slowly be getting better. And I just notice it in things like I'm able to move my arm to stabilize things better than I could before. Things like that. They're small things. It's not like magically I'm able to
Yeah.
run or anything like that, but they're noticeable and they impact on functioning.
I mean, just considering how long since the accident in 95 to now. So that's a one up for the nervous system, really. It's continues to impress and surprise.
Yeah, I know it's incredible. It is incredible.
So then two or three concepts which came up in your book, which I kind of want to touch on because I've seen it in other narratives. And one of them is this concept of the envy of those who are well. And I think that's when you are kind of when things were quite quite at the low level at the time for you. And you talked about their lives had not been ruined or destroyed by a simple road trip. How much is that envy a part of, well, acute or chronic illness? And was it a major thing then, or was it kind of just a fleeting?
I think it comes and goes, right? I think it comes and goes. I mean, because the accident was such a freak accident, and that it was hard for people to grasp. I mean, I remember residents when I was in, I think, the neuro ICU
Hmm.
were saying to me, well, were you drinking? Was the driver drinking? Like everybody wants to know that something has gone wrong. and that someone is at fault, and that's why this happened. And because in my case, that was not the case, it was random, or that's my experience of it, is it was just a random event. Then it made me sometimes feel particularly targeted. And also the driver wasn't really injured. And
Mm.
of course I didn't want him to be injured, but it does lead into this sense of, I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just in the car, and why did I have to sustain this? And at that time, what was happening was the nurses were going to a retreat in the mountains in Quebec. So they were going on the exact same road that I was going on. And I thought, again, not wanting anything to happen to them, I thought nothing's going to happen to them. And so there's this sense of feeling targeted. I don't think I ever felt like I was being punished.
Mm.
But I did feel, that targeted in that way. But
Mm.
but it comes and goes. Sometimes in the spring when I see people running,
Yeah.
I feel envious. I used to run. I
Mm.
mean, I didn't run as an athlete, but I used to run for exercise. I'll still feel that twinge, but for the most part, I just try to stay with where I am and what my path is in life.
Positive attitude. The other one is about when you said being disabled, and that's kind of one of the things you were bringing out in the book, meant you had crossed an invisible line and become other to the world at large, and even in some ways to yourself. What did you mean by that?
I guess first of all, in terms of being sort of crossed a line and became felt othered by others, um, was that it was this instantaneous way I was treated differently. I mean, we talked a bit about my experience, some of my negative experiences with the nurses, but even after I left rehab, after everything, I mean, when you are in the world as a person with a visible mobility disability, for example, um, people stare at you, they come up to you, they say sometimes sort of condescending things, sometimes cruel things. You're not given the same respect and boundaries often that I had experienced as an able-bodied person. And I think there's a sense in our society, and some people continue to embody this sense of that that ability is dichotomous. And so you are either able bodied or you're disabled. And I want to distance myself from the disabled component. And so all this sense of you are less than, generalizing about other competencies and abilities. It was my experience right away. It continues to be my experience to this day. The otherness I felt in myself, and we've sort of discussed this a bit, was that I had this new body I had to adapt to,
Mm.
where nothing was automatic, where I had to learn what the limits of it were, what I could do, what I couldn't do. And to, I had to learn, and I still struggle with this sometimes, fully embody the body that I've ended up with. And, and, and so so there's an otherness to that. Like I was right-handed, right? Why do I not get to be right-handed anymore? Why, you know, um, with time, and it has been almost 30 years, I am more accustomed
Okay.
to um, my the way I experience myself in the world since my injury, but there's still, there can still sometimes be an estrangement, and and so I think that's part of it too. I could say more, but I'll stop there.
And I think the other thing we haven't touched on is the effect, I suppose that was then rather than now, the impact the accident had on your relationships and even with your parents, isn't it? You talked about broken relationships being fixed, but then you also felt separate from people who you were together or close enough with. What was happening?
Well, I think I was fortunate. I had a lot of support from my family, and particularly very close friends, and that buoyed me. And I felt I was able to take in that support in a way I hadn't been able to before in my life. And so that was very helpful to me. But but the I'm trying to think of another word. I've used this word already, the intensity, but sort of the existential intensity of what had happened to me and what I was trying to survive
Mm.
and um trying to recover from and integrate from, um made me feel that um that the most meaningful relationship I had at that time was with myself, and sort of with my body, with my mind, trying to find a way to integrate them. And and it it's such, that kind of injury is so sudden and so absolute that I didn't have a lot of room for anything else. And even though I know, people that witnessed it, people that were with me throughout it, had empathy, certainly being able to be seen in some sense of continuity, as in they saw me as a person and as the person in terms of personality that I am and was. Um, I think that that's a very difficult thing to apprehend unless you've experienced it. And so that disconnection and isolation didn't feel like a negative thing.
Mm.
It felt like an embodiment of myself, and that was what was going to carry me forward.
Was it partly because nobody could understand what it is to be in that situation? You just, no matter how close anyone was to you.
I really don't think you can,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? I don't think you
Mm.
can. I mean, you can try, but every aspect of your physiology is affected,
Mhm.
right? It's so extreme. And you can't feel, like, there's just so many aspects to it. I mean, people notice and respond to the physical limitations, but there's so much more to it than that. And it really is an integral sense of self. And you can describe it, but I don't think people, I that's my feeling. It would be very hard to, unless you've embodied it, to know. And my experience might be very different from
Yes.
someone else's experience who also has a spinal cord injury. That's the other component.
So many lessons in the book. Are there any ones you'd like to highlight as these are the take-home messages a reader should kind of imbibe? I know we've talked about so many already.
I guess one thing I learned in terms of a life lesson for myself would be that having to accept the fact that you don't have control over your own life, and that the sense that you do is partly an illusion.
Mm.
I mean, there's certain parameters and there's certain areas where you do have control, but I guess one thing that I experienced and learned is that I couldn't have done anything to prevent that accident,
No.
right? It happened. For me, I mean, different people have interpreted and said to me what they think, you know, the cause of it is everything
Mm.
happens for a reason or there was some karmic sense. Maybe. But I guess my experientially, what I carry through from it is that random things happen, and that's okay. That's okay. That's existence. And to make peace with that, and part of making peace with it, I think, particularly as I get older, it's more important, is to just appreciate the moment.
Mm.
Just be in the moment that you have and try to extract what you can from that and just, you know, life is a fluid situation and be with the fluidity
Yeah.
no matter where it takes you.
I can't remember where I read it, but somebody kept talking about this why me question and put it back,
Yes.
why not me? Um, and
Exactly.
I can't remember where I read that somewhere. So if I'm plagiarizing someone, please. But yeah, I think it kind of feeds into what you were saying.
Absolutely.
Okay. Are you working on any project at the moment? Kind of
Well,
linked.
I'm still trying to write. One thing I do, and one thing I've kind of tried to do in terms of my feelings around sort of disability advocacy and marginalization of people with disabilities is one thing I am doing is I'm a member of my municipal accessibility committee. And so that gives me the opportunity to give input, particularly in terms of the built environment. In the small, I live in a small, Kingston's a small city. It's about 100,000 people, 150,000. And so that's very satisfying. It's very empowering to do that. It's not my background. I learned to read site plans and all these other things that have nothing to do with my previous life. But that's one thing I do sort of as a volunteer that I really enjoy. And then I am continuing to write. One project I have is I'm slowly trying to compile some essays,
Okay.
again, sort of around the theme of disability. I wrote one recently that focused on going back. My grandparents had a cottage when I was young that I haven't been to since I was 11. And we spent times there in the summer. And I recently, with a friend last fall, went back there to see it. And we were able to hire a pontoon boat that I could get on and be driven because just the way the lake system is by the cottage and sort of see the changes.
Hmm.
And so I wrote an essay kind of reflecting what it meant to go back so many years later, not just as an older person, but as a person with a disability, where I had been running freely there as a child. So that's one essay. And so I have sort of a set of essays I'm sort of gradually working on that I hope to compile. And then I'm actually writing a fictional book.
Okay.
Just not related to disability. We'll
Okay.
see how that goes.
Good luck with those. Um, any books you would like to recommend to me or to listen?
Yes, I would. And I actually wrote them down because I want to make sure I get their titles right. So one is actually about what we were talking about earlier, which is neuroplasticity.
Yeah, okay.
And that was the probably the first book I read on neuroplasticity, which is called The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge.
Okay.
And it came out quite a long time ago, 2007.
Okay.
And what I really appreciate about that book is that, and I assume in successive editions, they've updated the scientific component of it, but he talks about sort of neuroscience research, but also puts it in the context of patient stories.
Okay.
So it's a very readable book, even if you don't have a background in neuroscience. So that's one book that I really enjoyed and I would recommend. Another book I would recommend is called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, which I believe was also made into a movie. And it's written by Jean-Dominique Bauby. I might be saying his name wrong. It's Bauby.
Okay.
And that book is a first-hand account of someone who has locked-in syndrome. And he was in an accident, and basically through the help of an interpreter, through a series of eye blinks, dictated his book. He was a journalist.
Mm.
And so that's a very powerful book. Like you talk about hope and sustainability and what kind of life you can create. And so I really enjoyed that book. And it was also realistic, right? It didn't wasn't there's a term called inspirational porn, and where the person is like sort of lauded for what they've overcome. It's not like that. I don't know what it's like to have locked in syndrome, but it seems like it is a depiction of what that is like, but how you also live with that.
Mm.
And then the third one is from another Canadian, and it's called Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space. And that's written by someone called Amanda Leduc, Leduc. And she has cerebral palsy,
Okay.
and she writes about her experience of having cerebral palsy and her own experience with disability, but intersperses it with an examination of fairy tales and how
Mm.
the beast and the beauty dichotomy is treated, and how how that relates to sort of our conceptualizations, at least in Western cultures,
Mm.
Western fairy tales of disability. And she sort of puts forward an argument that we need other disability narratives that make space for other experiences of disability. So it's very interesting.
Oh,
It's
interesting.
it's interesting from her point of view, but the tie-in with sort of the cultural component is also very interesting.
Mm.
So those are three books I would recommend.
Thank you very much. They look um, different concepts, but all kind of tied in. Thank you very much for that. Okay, Susan Mockler, thank you very much for your time on this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. I'm very happy and I've enjoyed the conversation and learned quite a lot. Most grateful. To my audience, thank you so much for listening or watching the podcast. If you want to learn a bit more about the neurological aspect of this theme or other topics, you can check my database called Neuro Checklist. And I've also written a less dramatic book called Surfing the Brain, and that's kind of just bits and pieces of neurological tidbits. To make sure you don't miss the next episode of the podcast, you can subscribe to the iTunes, to the Spotify, YouTube channels. But until then, thank you very much for joining me. And Susan Mockler, thank you very much for your time. I'm most grateful.
Thank you.